Welcome to my studio again this week. This week I want to inspire you to pull out your sketchbooks and try and use some new materials. Some materials that you can actually make yourself. I want to show you how I make my own ink or watercolor brush pens. They are super easy to make, although a little bit messy, but you can have such fun with them. And the beauty is that you can make your own colors by color mixing the inks if you want to. So let me go ahead and show you how to make some of your own brush pens to play in your sketchbook with. But first, some new materials arrive at the studio, which may have something inside that I need to make some new brush pen colors with. Oh, thank you, Supernova, for the little bit of sweetness. That's very kind of you. Now, the first thing I've got in here is definitely not related to today's video, but it is something that I wanted to get. If you haven't watched my video on these lovely Vallejo acrylics, go and have a look at the video on these acrylics. I absolutely love using them, and so I thought I would order in this fluorescent magenta, which I know is going to be a color I will use a lot. I'll give you a little sneak peek at how beautiful this color is. It's so vibrant, and I know that I am going to use this as an undercoat or an underbase for a lot of paintings. I love to use this magenta or this bright fluorescent pink as a base coat for some of my larger paintings. So very chuffed with this, but it's not what I wanted to show you today. What I wanted to show you is in this box, and it is some inks that I am going to use today to make some new ink pens. Let me open this up and let's see what is in here. Now look at this. I have ordered in some new colors, and this is by Arranged by Vallejo, which we get in South Africa from a company called Supernova. It is a Spanish brand of paint that is imported into South Africa, and I absolutely love all of their products. As if you've watched any of my other videos, you'll know I love using their acrylics, and I explain to you why I love using them. So I have ordered in some of their watercolor, their liquid watercolors, because I want to use these to make some of the pens that I love using. I've also ordered in some of their drawing ink, which I have never tried before. So I thought that would be fun to have a look at as well. There is also some Indian ink, some sepia Indian ink that I ordered in. I won't be using that for today's tutorial, but maybe I will show it to you in another tutorial. Although, let me get out a piece of paper and we'll quickly just have a look at these colors of the inks, just in case you're intrigued and want to see. And then I will show you how I'm going to use these to make some new watercolor brush pens, because maybe you would like to make some too. So I'm going to be showing you today how I make these beautiful ink pens that I love to use. And I want to show you the colors that I've made so far. These are just two of the ink pens that I have already made, and I absolutely love these pens. I use them so much. This one is called Olive Green, and this one here is, I think, a turquoise one. If I remember correctly, I've used this ink over here. And let me just put the colors down so I can compare them to the colors that I am about to make. This turquoise is quite a deep turquoise, but I also love to work this turquoise into my greens and the foliage. So these are the two pens that I have already. I've just put them out on the page so I can compare to the new colors that I have just bought. And the inks that I've used in the past, I use just some local brands that we have here. But what I do is I always use a water-based ink. So in other words, an ink that can go into a fountain pen. I try and avoid using acrylic ink. I've it may still work, but I'm always worried that if the lid isn't put onto the brush properly, acrylic ink might actually dry the brush out and the brush may go hard, which with these water-based inks, which are used, can be used in fountain pen, I don't tend to have to worry about the brush drying out too much. So I've never tried using an acrylic ink for these brushes. And as I said, reason why I've avoided using acrylic ink is I'm always worried that if the ink, if the brush dries, then I'm going to be left with a really hard brush. So I just use some local water-based eco dyes or inks, and I want to compare to the colors that I have ordered in today because I'm wanting to make some new brushes and I'm going to make them with you so that you can see how I make them. Now, I have also ordered in some sepia India ink. I'm not going to be using this to make a brush today, but I do want to have a look what color it is. I always love it when inks have these little, what do you call them, dropper bottles, because it's a nice way to get the ink out. Whoa, that's really dark. Let me get my brush. And I do love a sepia color. Oh, look at that. I was expecting it to be a little bit more almost on the olive side. It's got quite a purpley undertone, but it is a lovely neutral color to use. So that is the sepia India ink, and I'm not going to be using it today, but I did want to just test and see what the color is. Now the colors I'm going to be using to make some pens today, I'm going to be using two different kinds of inks that I have ordered in, and you could use any water-based inks that you get in your country or wherever you live. These water-based dyes are called liquid watercolors. They are not light fast unless they are mixed with a gum arabic, and I don't have any gum arabic here, and I'm not too fussed about them being water fast because I always use these brush pens only in my sketchbooks. So I'm not too worried. The sketchbooks stay closed, they stay on my shelves. I'm not worried about them fading. I don't use these brush pens for work that I'm selling. I use it purely to play in my sketchbook. So the first color that I have got in, as I said to you earlier on with that acrylic paint, is a color that I absolutely love using. And I know that I am going to really enjoy this. It's quite hectic, it's quite potent. Oh, look at that. A lovely, delicious hot pink. As a matter of fact, I think it's even called hot pink. Yes, it's called hot pink. That is going to be gorgeous to turn into a brush pen. I'm going to really enjoy using that color. Then the next color I got was chartreuse, and it's also in this watercolor ink, this liquid watercolor. And I got the chartreuse because I thought it would be a beautiful color to bring out highlights and foliage. Now, I have already got an olive pen, so I really want to compare the chartreuse to the olive, and I'm hoping that they're going to be two different color greens. Yes, it's definitely a more yellowy green, and the olive is definitely a more brown-based green. Oh, goodness, look at the intensity of that green. Look at the green next to that pink. Let's actually run the green over the pink. Whoa, this is a potent color. Look at that, almost looks like fluorescent yellow. All right, I'm very happy with the chartreuse green. I think that's going to be a great color for bringing out some highlights. Quite an overpowering color though. I'm going to have to be careful about how I use it. So those are the two colors, water-based dyes that I have bought in, and I'm going to turn both of those into pens like this. And then I ordered in some drawing ink. Now, the drawing ink, it's also a Vallejo ink, and this drawing ink can also be used in fountain pens. So I know that the chances are it's not going to dry out the nibs of my brushes. And let's have a look. I've ordered in a nice blue because I love using almost like a ultramarine.
Well, my microphone cord accidentally got bumped by one of the dogs, and so only when I started editing did I realize that I've lost all the audio on my video. However, the blue was definitely a tone that I was happy with. The white, however, proved to be a little bit more problematic. I was really hoping that I would have a white that I could use over or on top of the other colors, but unfortunately, when I opened it up, and started putting it over the other colors on the page, I suddenly noticed that for some reason it just disappeared before my eyes. It's almost like magic. Can you see what it's doing there? As I'm putting the ink on the page, it was literally starting to disappear before my eyes. I thought at first that I was imagining it. I even got the brush out and started going over it. But lo and behold, every single time I put the white ink onto the page, it just disappeared before my eyes. Not quite what I was expecting for a white ink. Do you see what I mean? The white ink just disappears as I am putting it on the page. I thought maybe it was the type of ink that it was going over the top of, but lo and behold, every single time I put it down, the white ink seemed to just evaporate off of the page. Not quite sure why it was happening. It really had me fooled, as the blue ink seemed to be absolutely fine. So I decided to pull out my sketchbook with the craft paper, the brown paper on, and see if perhaps the white ink worked a little bit better on the darker paper. I was hoping that it would go over the materials. I simply went to a page where I tested some other materials, and when I put it down, it did go down fine on the craft paper, and it seemed to go over a couple of the other materials in the book. I had also in the interim given the bottle a really good shake, so I'm thinking that perhaps I didn't quite shake the bottle enough before I opened it the first time. Perhaps it needed a good mix, but it seemed to work absolutely fine on the craft paper, so I thought I would go ahead and make a white brush pen and see if the ink is going to be fine on the pages of other sketchbooks. Now, unfortunately, I still haven't realized that the dogs, who are always under my feet in the studio, have actually pulled the cable out from the microphone. So I'm busy explaining to you here how I purchase in a lot of brush pens, and I often have to buy them in sets because when I am traveling, I don't like to always travel with water or pots of water, and I find these little brush pens, especially when you're out of the studio, are super easy. Even in the studio, when you're working in your sketchbooks, it's nice to grab one. I love these fatter brush tips, so just like I'm showing you here, I love the ones that have got the fatter tips on them, but they are really hard to find in single sets. So I often end up having to order an entire pack just for the two thicker ones, which means that while I now have some of the thicker heads to use, I'm now left with an entire bunch of small brushes that I don't necessarily use too much because I don't need more than one small brush pen. So I have a whole lot of these small brush pens lying around from the packs that I buy, and so these are what I have been using to turn into the ink pens. So this is what you need to get started. You need to find yourself some brush pens like this. You can buy them in the sets like I normally buy, or you can also just purchase them individually from any art supply store. You can see here, this is exactly what I've used with the brush pens that I've already made, only instead of filling the back of the brush pen with water, as one would do if you were traveling with them, I have used watercolor based inks or dyes to fill the back of the brushes with. And it is that simple to make your own brush pens. You can also mix colors, so you can make up your own brush pens as well. So if that chartreuse green was a little bit too green, you could add a dash of blue to it or add another color to it and end up making your own colors. So let's start making our brush pen. Open up the back of your brush pen where you would normally insert the water in the little back cavity. This is where you are now going to tip your ink into. I'm going to start off with this blue ink. Thank goodness this blue ink does have a nice little dropper on the bottle, which makes it easier to get the ink into the back of the pen. If, however, you don't have an ink that has some kind of dropper on it, you may need to use a little pipette or something that, a little dropper that you can suck up the ink into and then drop it into the back of the pen. So let's fill up the pen. Now this can be quite a messy job, so you want to make sure that you have got a cloth on hand. You also want to make sure that you are doing this over maybe either a book that you can work on top of, or a piece of paper, or make sure you're not using anything that you don't mind spilling a bit of ink onto, because it can get a little bit messy if a few drops escape. But you want to make sure that you have filled it to about a third or halfway up the shaft of the water pen. You don't want to fill it right up to the top. In my experience, if you fill it up to the top, you've got more chance of pressure building up and then the pen leaking if the ink is filled right up to the top. So generally I tend to fill it to about a third of the way. You'll be surprised how much that ink actually lasts. It'll be quite a while before you need to fill it up again. If you want to, you can add a little bit of water to the ink if you want to dilute it a little bit. If you find it's too dark or too potent, you can put a few little drops of water in there, but I wouldn't fill it up more than halfway. So clean off the base of the ink shaft where you have put the ink into. Attach your brush tip back on again. Make sure it is securely attached. And then, of course, you want to allow the ink to start filtering down to the brush tip at the bottom. You need to be a little bit patient here. If you go squeezing too hard on the pen and you haven't closed that little part there where they join, you can sometimes get some leaking ink from there. But if you've wiped it off and you don't squeeze too hard, just allow the ink to gently start to seep through, you shouldn't have any messing. But you do just need to be patient now and let it filter down to the brush. A little bit of patience and there you have it. You have a brand new ink brush that you can play and explore and experiment with. These are lovely to use in your sketchbooks, and as long as you are just careful with them, if you need to open them and refill them, know that it is going to be just a little bit messy, but they are super fun to play with and a great way to make your own colors or invest in some brush pens to be able to play in your sketchbooks with. As I said though, remember to only fill it until halfway so that your pen doesn't leak all over the show when you start to use it. So let's get cracking. It's time to make a couple of pink, green and white brush pens. So let's recap what you need if you want to make yourself some ink or watercolor pens. First of all, you need a water brush, the brush type of traveling water brush where you can pop water in the back of your brush. You need a couple of these spare. You need some watercolor or water-based ink or drawing ink. It must be, I find, the kind of ink that can either be used in a fountain pen or a water-based dye like a watercolor ink. So you're going to need some water-based inks. You're going to need a brush pen. Do have a cloth on hand because it is messy business when you're making them. And of course, if your ink doesn't have a nozzle that allows you to be able to pour the ink into the base of the pen, you may need a bit of a dropper to drop the ink in. And I like to keep a bottle with some water on hand so that I can top it up a little bit with some water if I want to dilute the ink a little bit. Remember, my top tip is don't fill your ink right to the top. I find that they have a greater chance of leaking if you do that. I suggest filling it to halfway or even a third.
or filling it to a third and topping up with just a little bit of water if you want to dilute it. As easy as that. That's all you need to make yourself an array of water-based or ink pens to play with in your sketchbook. So thanks for joining me again in my studio. I've loved being able to share with you how to make your own ink or watercolor pens. They're super messy to make, but they're such fun to play with in your sketchbook. So I hope you go ahead and give it a try. If you've enjoyed today's video, I'd love you to hit the like button. It helps me to be able to share with more people. And if you want to join me again, hit subscribe. I'll see you here next week with more inspiration from my studio, and I'd love to meet you too. So pop a comment in the comments below, or just pop in and say hi. Anyway, from my studio to yours, see you again soon.